Good morning. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the PT on Ice Daily Show. My name is Christina Previtt. I am one of the team within our pelvic health division. We have two courses in our pelvic health space. We have our two-day online or a two-day live course, rather, where we teach the basics of the internal assessment and then bridge that into fitness. We are actually doing our last live course of 2022 this weekend in my hometown in Concord, North Carolina, just outside of Charlotte. We still have a couple of spots left if you're interested in diving into that course. Otherwise, we have our next cohort for our online course, which is our 8-week online course that goes from the female athlete preconception into pregnancy and into postpartum considerations for fitness. That is 8 weeks long, and our next course is starting the beginning of January. So if you are interested in doing some remote learning with us, that's your next opportunity for our pregnancy and postpartum course. All right, today I wanted to talk to you all about a new study that I published with a group of collaborators that really just tried to bust some myths around lifting and pregnancy. So I want to give you a little bit of a background of how the study came to be, why we did it the way we did, what we found, and what some next steps are with respect to this study. When we're kind of in the research world, if you all don't know, I'm in the process of finishing up a PhD in geriatrics. So been really involved in the research space and learning a lot about research methodology. When we are doing a study where we are, and so a study is when we are collecting data from individuals or in a different method like basic sciences can be from animal models, etc. We have to put a protocol in, and that protocol has to be reviewed by an ethics board to make sure that it is safe. And then they will go through any revisions, and we cannot do any type of recruitment for information or collect any data until we have ethics approval from an institution. When it came to pregnancy and lifting, we have heard all of the advice, right? Don't lift on your back. Don't do any exercise on your back. Don't let your heart rate go over 140. Don't hold your breath when you're lifting. Don't lift more than 20 pounds. And many of these recommendations are well-meaning because of theoretical information or theoretical thoughts around mechanisms of blood flow and pregnancy physiology. And some of these recommendations come because we don't have any data that is different than that. And what I mean by that is the 20-pound recommendation is because most of our resistance training studies, I mean, all of our resistance training studies in pregnancy had that as like an upper level. So if we don't have any evidence of people who are lifting 200 pounds and we only have evidence for people who are lifting 20 pounds, then the recommendation is to not go above the threshold at which we have data to support that lifting is safe. So to go from having only one resistance training study that looks at, 20 pounds, and we have more than one, but, just to kind of talk about the thought process behind it, to say, I want to demo these individuals who are deadlifting 200 pounds, 9 months pregnant, it's a bit of a stretch. So the first thing we had to do was figure out, is there a need for research in this space? And we already know the answer, right? We know that women are doing this. We see it every single time or every single day on social media. We have friends, family, and maybe you that have lifted heavy during their pregnancy and don't feel supported because there's no research to give us any guidance around what is safe and what isn't. So our justification to our ethics board was, well, let's try and see if we can recruit women and to answer a survey and talk to us about heavy resistance training. It's a massive gap in the research. Let's see what happens. And so we got ethics approval for that. And this is the reason why we started with a cross-sectional survey to try and describe what people are already doing. The goal of that is to say, well, whether we have guidelines on this or not, we are seeing it in clinical practice. So we should probably be looking at it. And so we did a cross-sectional survey. We kind of blasted it all over social media, and we recruited just under 700 individuals. We got 679 people who participated in this survey. And our eligibility criteria was that you had to have been lifting pre-pregnancy and continued to lift over 80%, at least for some parts of your pregnancy. And then we kind of characterized what type of exercise you continue to do. Did you continue Olympic lifting? Did you continue lifting on your back? Did you use the Valsalva maneuver? And what were some of the things that happened during your pregnancy, if any? How did your labor and delivery go? And what did your postpartum return look like? Because one of the other things that we see a lot being advocated in the pelvic health space is things like don't lift heavy because your pelvic floor is already strained. Don't Valsalva because your pelvic floor is already strained and it adds more strain. And we had no data to say, is this true or not? We were going with, this is what we think is true based on, what our mechanisms or thoughts around the pelvic floor are in pregnancy. So we tried to challenge all of those things. So the first thing is that we had 88% of these individuals were recreational athletes. And I think this is important because we do have some studies on elite athletes who return to sport really quickly. But when we have elite level athletes, that's their job. So it's like us returning to our job at 6 weeks postpartum. And unfortunately, that's kind of the state of the United States right now, where there is a lot of people who are returning to work at 6 to 12 weeks postpartum. So saying to elite, like comparing elite athletes and saying, well, they're back to 75% of their training volume by 12 weeks postpartum, it's really easy to say, well, they're elite and that's their job. So this study was 88% of individuals were recreational. And then we had some regional, provincial, national, and international athletes who also contributed some of their information, which was really cool. When we looked at the amount that individuals were lifting fairly heavy throughout their pregnancy. And these were individuals who were lifting before. I have the study up so that I can just give all the percentages. When we looked at reproductive outcomes, pregnancy or delivery complications were reported in 34% of respondents, so 201 out of 589. And that may seem like a lot. So I wanted to kind of break down what some of those complications are and what they are with respect to normative values that we see in the general population. So incidence of gestational diabetes was 1%, preeclampsia was 3%, and gestational hypertension was 3%. This is significantly below national norms with respect to cardiovascular complications during pregnancy, because we're kind of accumulating all the things that could potentially go wrong. We saw cesarean section was the most common considered complication. And that happened in 77 out of 589 people who responded to that question. So 13% of individuals who were reported or who responded to that question on the survey had a C-section. And as you know, that is below right now the national average for cesarean section within the United States. And so that's another kind of positive. And so while that 20% might seem like a lot, when we break it down into the individual subcomponents, the rates and incidences of complication during pregnancy in individuals who lifted heavy are actually below normative values. And there's a lot that we can extrapolate from that. We can't say lifting heavy prevents gestational hypertension, because the confounding variable there is that individuals who are continuing to lift heavy may have a lot of other lifestyle factors that they are prioritizing during their pregnancy, which may also incur a reduction in risk. So we're not saying lift heavy and you'll potentially prevent gestational hypertension. That may be true. We don't have longitudinal data to support that yet. But what we can say is that there doesn't seem to be an increase in risk for individuals who are lifting heavy and things like cardiovascular complications like gestational hypertension and preeclampsia. And then we don't have right now any data to support that lifting heavy is going to lead to increased risk for cesarean section. So we don't have a causative there, but we're starting to see some correlations. We had 37% of individuals who experienced urinary incontinence during pregnancy. That is fairly standard compared to late-term incontinence in most pregnancies that we see. The interesting part about the urinary incontinence in pregnancy is that the individuals who experienced incontinence during their pregnancy tended to be weaker than those that didn't. So individuals who did not experience incontinence during pregnancy had a heavier pre-pregnancy back squat and deadlift. That's really interesting, right? Because we see that individuals who lift heavy are at higher rates for pelvic floor dysfunction. And so it's reasonable to assume that because lifters have high incidence of pelvic floor issues and pregnancy is a big risk factor for pelvic floor issues, that the combination of those two things would incur greater risk. And that was not supported. That's not what we saw. And so that's a really interesting finding. Now going into the postpartum space, this is where we really started busting myths, because during pregnancy, the guidelines around lifting heavy or reductions in lifting are to set us up for a good postpartum recovery. And so we were asking about that. So what were some of the issues that you potentially had after delivery? Depression and anxiety numbers were 7% of individuals who responded to that question had postpartum mood disorders. That is, again, below national averages that we're seeing for individuals postpartum. So again, we are maybe hinting at or need to investigate more if lifting during pregnancy or lifting postpartum is incurring a protective effect for postpartum or perinatal mood disorders. Diastasis recti was only present in 4% of individuals postpartum. Another thing that is unfortunately sometimes talked about is that if you lift heavy during pregnancy, you're more likely to have diastasis recti during your postpartum journey. I would say that 4% is below the average that we see across most pregnant individuals if we were to accumulate numbers. And that to me just makes so much sense, because the research on diastasis recti is demonstrating, or a separation of the abdominal wall that persists later on postpartum, is that for many, it is a weakness issue. We show less trunk extensor strength. We show less strength in our abdominal wall for individuals who have diastasis recti than those that don't. And so if we're continuing to lift heavy during pregnancy and prioritizing core strength, this is our first kind of glimpse that heavier resistance training, which would incur heavier core training, may have some potentially protective effect. Again, I can't overstate because we're looking at correlations here, not causations, but it gives us another question to say, maybe we should be looking at this a little bit more. And then other things is that 57% of individuals experienced some urinary incontinence at least immediately postpartum. Again, that seems like a really high number, but I would argue, one, that most people, especially early postpartum, are going to experience some urinary incontinence, especially after a vaginal birth. The other thing that I would respond to that is that individuals who are returning to heavy lifting are pushing their bodies really far. And so they're going to be starting to get to that barrier where they're pushing it and seeing where those limits are and where they exist. And so my response to that is that 57% had rehab needs. And this is where we need to be advocating for that role of pelvic floor physical therapy. The other really interesting part, and I know I'm going really late with this because this is a really big study, is that only 14% of individuals who lifted heavy experienced some subjective symptoms of prolapse. That is massive, because again, that is probably on par with or below what we see for individuals postpartum. And it's a big way that we scare people into not lifting. Your organs are going to fall out of your body. You're going to set yourself up for a bad postpartum recovery. You shouldn't be lifting heavy. You already have so much stress and strain with the baby. And now, again, we don't have evidence to support that exists. Taking this a step further, we did a subgroup analysis looking at individuals who participated in different things that were considered to be risky during pregnancy and rates of pelvic floor dysfunction postpartum. So when we saw individuals who continued to Olympic weightlift during pregnancy and compared risk for urinary incontinence, anal incontinence, and prolapse postpartum, we did not see an increase in risk for those that continued doing Olympic weightlifting until delivery and those that didn't on any postpartum outcomes or any pelvic floor issues. When we looked at people who continued to do Valsalva, so 34% of individuals that we surveyed continued to Valsalva, holding their breath and bracing hard during their pregnancy, and we did not see an increased risk for urinary incontinence, anal incontinence, or prolapse when we compared those that continued to Valsalva and those that didn't. That is a massive finding because now the only evidence that we have shows that Valsalva during pregnancy, we have multiple studies that show for maternal and fetal cardiovascular outcomes that Valsalva isn't bad. But now we have an inkling of correlative data that shows that Valsalva may not be bad for the pelvic floor during pregnancy either, which is interesting because it really challenges a lot of the ways that pelvic floor physical therapists in general have been taught and my own biases, because I tend to advocate for avoiding Valsalva in the second trimester and onward to reduce strain on the pelvic floor. And now I'm questioning my own teaching, saying, is this needed? Or can we allow individuals to brace and lift in the way that they want to, and we modify if or when pelvic floor dysfunction can come up? So really interesting findings that we came out of with this study. When we think about next steps here, we cannot overstate our claims with this paper. The idea here was to show, one, that women are, or females are, lifting heavy during pregnancy, and two, give some safety and feasibility kind of look into what are our risk factors here? What are things that we may need to look out for? And then use this to try and figure out what our next step is. And so the next step for this is that we need longitudinal data in pelvic health when it comes to the athletic population. We have so many cross-sectional surveys, and I've contributed to this problem, where we know that women leak during sport. We know that pelvic floor dysfunction goes up whenever there's a big fluctuation in female hormones, which perinatally is a big issue, and perimenopausal, menopausal females is another one. We know that this exists. Now we need to know what to do about it or try and characterize it a little bit further. So the next goals for me would be to do a systematic review and meta-analysis looking at dose responses with respect to the available literature based on resistance training in pregnancy, and then take that a step further and get individuals into a longitudinal study and follow their patterns over time to see how, what, or when they modify their exercises and what were some of their criteria at which they did that. Final thing is that when we looked at when individuals returned to lifting postpartum, average was 12 weeks plus or minus 3 months. This does not say that you should start returning to lifting at 12 weeks postpartum. That is not how to interpret this data. It said that on average, females got back to lifting at 12 weeks plus or minus 3 months. So that meant the average, the 50%, was at 3 months, and then 50% of individuals were less than 3 months, and 50% of individuals were greater than 3 months. That's a very simplistic way of thinking about it, but this is the way that I want to make sure that it is being interpreted. It is not a hard 12-week deadline. That does not exist. We do not have that data. And so we should not be discouraging lifting in the first 12 weeks postpartum. I would recommend us to gradually be overloading and not going from 0 to nothing at 6 weeks. I'm going to say the same thing from 0 to 12 weeks. We want to make sure that we are interpreting this data appropriately and then knowing what inferences we can make and what we cannot make based on cross-sectional data. All right, that was a lot. If you are interested in the paper, let me know. I've had a lot of people asking. It's really wonderful to see how excited people are about this paper. If you are accessing it, please look at the supplementary tables. They give you a ton of information that gives us a better idea of how we can clinically interpret this. We just couldn't get it all into the manuscript because there was a lot there to unpack. If you have any other questions, please let me know. Otherwise, if you want, actually, we're going to put this paper into PPP on Ice. That's our bi-weekly newsletter that's specific to pelvic health. And it did go out in Hump Day Hustling. I can put a link to the paper, but if you search heavy lifting or impact of heavy resistance training on pregnancy, it is an open access paper. So you should be able to just search the title and you'll be able to access that PDF. There's a link there. I hope you all enjoyed this podcast, and I'm super excited for more research to come. Hope you have a wonderful Monday. I'm going to get off here now because I'm already at 20 minutes. Bye, everyone.